Hello, this is Linkonair, and today we'll be reviewing Castlevania Lords of Shadow. I originally planned on reviewing Metro Last Light, but with the upcoming release of Dark Souls 2, it has me in a sort of Castlevania-y mood. Until now, I hadn't played all the way through Lords of Shadow, because when I last played it, I was underwhelmed, because I was expecting it to be a Metroidvania-style exploration, mostly because the first time around I was under the impression that all Castlevanias were like Symphony of the Night. How naive of me. But now that I've played it through all the way, and the DLC, has my opinion changed? Well, let's get started and find out. This game follows a man by the name of Gabriel Belmont, a member of a Brotherhood of Holy Knights who has been tasked with the elimination of the Lords of Shadow, the strongest beings in a land being overrun by evil. His motivation to take this mission is his dead wife, who he plans to bring back to life if all goes well. If you can't tell, this is a fairly standard fantasy setup, which early on can lead to a fair bit of disappointment, as the only creatures you encounter for the first third of the game are trolls, giant spiders, and variations on werewolves. Nothing will really stick out until you encounter your first Dark Lord. But if The Last of Us has taught us anything, it's that you can have as generic a setup as you want, as long as the execution is good. Which fortunately, in this regard, Lords of Shadow holds up. The writing is incredibly solid, all characters are well voiced, and lore scrolls can help flesh out the world, though lore scrolls are easily the weakest part of the storytelling, as they mostly reiterate plot points you're already aware of or will be made aware of through the use of cutscenes or Patrick Stewart's narration. And this narration is probably what helped put the story in a better light for me within itself. In fact, Patrick Stewart voices a character outside the narration as well, though it doesn't fit in as naturally as the other characters, because if you're like me, you'll be distracted by the fact that it's clearly Patrick Stewart. I can't really say a whole lot more on the story without diving into spoiler territory, but overall the story and characters are handled well. But without spoiling, the ending is incredibly weak, and leaves more questions than answers, and not in the good way. The gameplay, on the other hand, is a bit strange. I often hear people call it a God of War ripoff, and a year ago I probably would have agreed with you. But I don't think that quite fits, because unlike God of War, hacking and slashing isn't the only way to get through the game, as the combat in Lords of Shadow is much more fast, skillful, and not too dissimilar from a 2D fighting game, if you were to put it in a 3D environment, that is. Your primary weapon in the game is a legendary vampire killer, which if you're not familiar with Castlevania is a whip, which can be amplified with both light and dark magics. Light allows you to heal with each direct hit on an enemy, while dark just boosts attack damage. As you progress through the game, you will acquire experience, which you will be able to put towards the purchase of skills, which can be applied to both the Whip Vanilla and the Light and Dark variants, which I highly recommend doing, because without it the combat will be a real chore. Until you find a good set of moves to use yourself, you may struggle with the combat early on. Apart from the whip, you also are given a small selection of sub-weapons, such as throwing daggers, holy water, fairies, and a screen nuke, which aren't really worth dwelling on, though they're certainly useful. For those of you who aren't particularly good at hack and slashers or fighting games, you may want to focus on light magic, as staying alive in a horde of enemies can be difficult till you get a grip on things. Despite this, I actually take quite a lot of issue with the combat against regular enemy encounters, of which the biggest problem is the camera, which is fixed, leading to a number of moments where an enemy will blindside you from off-screen, which can be infuriating at the best of times. It certainly doesn't help that the camera is also far out as well, which makes it harder to tell when the enemy is about to attack or whether or not you should dodge or block. If it weren't for the fact that unblockable attacks had a special sound effect in combat, it would be far too flawed to be fun. It's not too bad in small groups of enemies, but if you're up against a horde or a group of larger enemies, it's definitely going to make the problem more distracting. There are a number of enemies in the game as well that make me wonder just what the hell the developers were thinking, such as Reapers. They spawn in hordes and have insta-kill attacks. They're reasonably easy to kill, but when you misstep, you'll be sent back to the last checkpoint. The best thing I can say about the combat is that the one-on-one encounters in the game are breathlessly intense and exciting, because they are the true test of skill in this game, and unlike other enemy encounters, the camera is always close to Gabriel, and is always focused on your target, usually a boss, as the case may be. Also, while this isn't technically combat in the general sense, there are 3 giant monster boss fights. The first 2 are poor attempts to copy Shadow of the Colossus, the way I see it, and the third fight is actually pretty fun and fairly unique, but it's near the end of the game, so I won't get into it. With the combat out of the way, it's time to talk about the exploration, as that makes up the other half of the gameplay. Though it's not a lot to talk about. There are a great number of times where you'll have to put your wall climbing, platforming, and puzzle solving skills to the test, all of which are handled really well, and the camera can generally be relied upon to be exactly where you need it to be. The puzzles are actually quite challenging most of the time, and the reward for them is pretty good as well. However, if you're not particularly good at puzzle solving, there's always the option of skipping the puzzle at the cost of the bonus experience points. My only complaint about the puzzles is one that occurs near the end of the game that isn't a puzzle, it's memorization. It's literally impossible to solve on your first try without the internet or clairvoyance. Overall, the gameplay is pretty solid. I feel it's stronger than the God of War games in most respects, despite its annoyances. The visual design in the game is absolutely fantastic. Mostly. The visuals aim for a realistic approach, which I'd normally harp on about, but it's executed with style, something I used to think impossible. To be able to adequately stylize realistic visuals must take quite a lot of skill. And to put the cherry on top, every single chapter has its own standout environments, each of which is absolutely drenched in atmosphere being difficult to quantify. The sheer number of different environments in the game is insane for a modern game. Kinda makes me wonder why so many games stick to the standard fantasy setting or ultra-realistic environments. Must be out of laziness or something. Though, like the gameplay, the visuals isn't without complaints. Most human characters look kinda off, with the exception of Gabriel. And actually, no, that's it. This is more of a nitpick, but the designs for the trolls, giant spiders, and werewolves seem pretty run-of-the-mill. Perhaps it can't be helped. The rest of the creatures, however, are fairly creative and interesting. Now for the soundtrack with the musical Monocle.
I'm not ashamed to admit that the name Castlevania alone has made me truly excited to review this soundtrack. Why wouldn't it? Castlevania is a series that is highly revered for its music, and its melodic content has generally been key to this. However, if you were expecting a new and exciting approach to these motifs so highly treasured by the fandom, then you may find yourself a bit disappointed by the severe underutilization of these classic themes. This isn't to say that it's not a new or exciting development for the franchise, quite the contrary in fact. This title, more than any other before it in the series, is geared towards cinema and action, 2 elements that are being more widely utilized in gaming by the year. However, that doesn't keep the nostalgia-fed monster in my stomach from lamenting at the possibility of exploiting classic motifs in the epically dark way that this soundtrack demonstrates the ability to do. Certainly, this quality score is not void of genre-appropriate elements. You hear gothic choirs, bell tolls, and plagal cadences handled in richer ways than ever before in the series, and the soundtrack is filled with danger, horror, and emotion used in almost unanimously appropriate context. This quality soundtrack is highly effective, but it's kind of like meeting an old friend at the beach and expecting to build sandcastles like good old times, only to find that they'd rather go swim with the big fish.
Before I give my verdict, since the version of the game I played came with all of the DLC, I will be touching on that. Both Reverie and Resurrection help tie up the loose end from the ending of the game vanilla, but the story, sadly, is told through the use of still images, infamous style, which doesn't really work for this game. Not to mention that Resurrection actually had some endgame cinematics right up until the end, so there's really no excuse for not having them through both DLC chapters, unless the budget ran out or something. Pretty much all the enemies you encounter are from the main game, with the exception of the boss, which isn't even encountered until the Resurrection DLC. However, this DLC boss is cheap. I've had people tell me Lords of Shadow wasn't built for air combat, and nowhere is this more apparent than with this boss. You see, there's no mid-air guard in this game, and this boss will require you to jump just to hit him, which isn't helped at all by the fact that he uses almost exclusively area effect attacks whenever you're close enough to actually hit him, and unless your reflexes are fast, you're going to get hit. This is the only boss in the game that actually forced me to lower the difficulty to avoid frustration. I never lower the difficulty in games. This is insane. I can handle a challenge, but not this kind of crap. If your copy of Lords of Shadow doesn't come with the DLC, I'd say you're better off skipping it. To wrap things up, this game gets a 7 out of 10. The story is strong with Patrick Stewart, good character development, and good voice acting. The gameplay was solid for the most part, with the only minor issues being the fixed hammer in the combat scenarios, and the one memorization puzzle. The visuals are absolutely fantastic apart from the look of human characters, so yes, this game is a definite buy. I love this game, as infuriating as it could be sometimes. Avoid the DLC though, unless of course it comes with the game. If you enjoyed this review, like and subscribe, and feel free to share it with your other gaming buddies. If you have any game recommendations or feedback, leave it in the comments. Next time I will be reviewing the newest entry in the series, Castlevania Lords of Shadow 2. What a horrible night to have a curse.